So okay, let's go. Let's continue. So we're doing this for the Cholim of Bavli Israel and all the Cholim who need a speedy refuah. And this is continuing with the theme of Gentiles doing performing a malacha on behalf of the Jew on Shabbos.
Okay.
Okay. So the next chapter is now Arthur. Gentile is not a non-Jewish person that does your tithing. Okay, you know that, Arthur. Okay. Okay, so deriving benefit from Gentile activity. If a malacha has been done under circumstances other than the above, under the exceptions that we mentioned yesterday, one may not derive direct personal benefit from it, even if the malacha was not requested. Direct personal benefit means either A, taking advantage of an item whose attraction arose from the malachic activity, example, eating food cooked by a Gentile, or B, engaging in an activity which is made possible only by the malacha. For example, reading by a light which was turned on in a previously dark room, obviously by a Gentile. Okay, one may make use of a Gentile's activity when such direct personal benefit doesn't occur. 3 examples here. If a light was turned on and there was already sufficient light with which to read, one may read a book in the room. B, if a sealed envelope was opened by a Gentile, one may read the letter, since the malacha relates to the envelope rather than the letter or the opening of the envelope. And C, a light which is turned off is not considered direct personal benefit, even if it enables one to go to sleep, because then you can take that one to the nth degree. If, let's say, a Jew turns on a light, you're staying with someone who doesn't keep Shabbos. If while you're there, they switch, you have to actually leave the room, but if the light gets switched off. I mean, I know this applies to non-Jews, but you're not benefiting from a dark room. You're benefiting from a room that's light that you can read. I suppose you are benefiting if you want to go to sleep, but if a Jew turns on a light and you're in a room that was dark previously, you have to leave it. That's what I believe. And just 2 more points here. If the malacha of a Gentile has not changed the intrinsic nature of an article, there is a view that one may derive benefits from it on Shabbos. Cooking or grinding would change the nature of food, but carrying would not. One may therefore benefit from items which were carried through the street by a Gentile. A Jewish partner of a firm whose other partners conduct their businesses on Shabbos or festivals must enter into an agreement with them. They should stipulate that one will not receive any profits accrued by the firm from work carried out on these days. Rabbi called the chief, and the chief rabbi was a rabbi of Sunny Road. He actually mentioned this. That you actually have to give the money to tzedakah. You can't keep it for yourself.
Yeah. When it becomes relevant is, for example, is for example certain shopping centers, not now, like previous to COVID, Kevin, that they had to, like Santon, keep open for a certain number of business hours. And they had to, as part of being in the shopping center,
a release agreement,
a lease agreement, go within certain trading hours.
Yeah.
So yeah, things like that. Or the logistical things, I don't know how it would work like in a factory, where I think on Yom Tov, my brother does keep open, but he doesn't get the shares of the business, but I think they need to do deliveries. So I don't know if that's minus from the profits or expenditure that you do doesn't count as a problem. But he looked into it like quite in depth.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how they operate.
What is the solution? What was the answer?
But 8 days this month, including Heritage Day, is quite something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Arthur's here, Kevin's gone.
Yeah, I'm not here. I'm just taking my shirt off. I don't want this to be recorded because
Okay, we could get
I'll get censured by the sneers police.
Hold on, I must say. On screen.
No. I stepped aside, Arthur. Carry on. You can start. It's okay.
All right, so listen, Arthur, I'm going to just do a bit of revision for a minute or two for you, because you weren't well yesterday. So this is for you. Thumbs up if you're hearing me. Good. All right. So Arthur, basically, we're going to get to your water story soon. There's a ruling related to what we're going to say. It's in the 51st daf in B. And there's a case where you place one tefach high stone at the edge of a 9 tefach pit and thereby completed it to a depth of 10 tefachim. We have arrived at a dispute between Rebbe and the rabbis. According to Rebbe, the second person is exclusively liable for death, and should the ox get injured, both parties are liable for injuries. They share that. But if there's a death that results, the last one that made it a lethal pit is liable. According to the rabbis, the second one is exclusively is liable even for injuries. Because you must remember that the rabbis read the verse, if a man shall dig a pit or a man shall uncover a pit, singular. So they turn that to mean that there can only be one person culpable. All right, so the Gemara basically says, well, why does Rava need to mention that? We've mentioned it already. So we say, look, you might have thought that it's different if you add a tefach to the top of the pit compared to the bottom. What's the difference? Is that if you add a tefach to the bottom by digging it, then what happens is that at the bottom of the pit, the air is at its most toxic. And at that point, you can understand why the liability would increase to 10 tefach. But maybe if you put an extra 10 tefach of bricks around, it wouldn't add to the foul air. Now, for impact, obviously, if you're holding like Shmuel, because Shmuel holds for both impact and foul air, if you've now created an extra step up and the animal gets mangled, well, you have to pay. If it's according to Rav, is the foul air as bad if you add a tefach to the top or not? And you could say maybe it's not, and that's why you don't have to pay. So we learn in the Gemara that is as bad, because what the issue is that it's unable to escape, meaning that at a certain height, the inability for the toxicity and the particles of the foul air to escape is inhibited. The minute it reaches 10 tefach, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily less if you put a tefach high, providing, as Gavin quite rightly said yesterday, it's not like a stoop. It's all around where that air can't escape. So you've added a certain depth evenly. So Gavin's correct there. Now, we learned another thing, Arthur, is that Rava inquired, if you dug the 10 tefach and you filled it with earth, or maybe you added a tefach of stones around all the top, around the whole top layer, right? And you removed the stones. What's the law? Do we say that when he originally made it, and now that he's removed it, the liability is lifted from him and reverts to the first digger because he undid his damage? Or do we say that perhaps when he increased the depth of the pit of 10 tefachim, legally the action of the first one was set aside, and from that moment onward, the pit stood completely in the jurisdiction of the last one? That although it's only 9 tefach deep, because the last one removed his action, he's exclusively liable for anything that it causes, okay? Now, obviously, according to Rashi, this inquiry only pertains after to the opinion of the rabbis, who says that when the second person adds a 10 tefach to the pit, he assumes full liability even for damages, and therefore you set aside the first one. But according to Rebbe, the first one's actions can't be described as ever having been put aside, because he remained liable for a share of the damage in case of injury. And obviously that full death liability is removed when it's no longer 10 tefach high. So this is a discussion amongst the rabbis. And what is the resolution? Well, the Gemara offers no resolution to the inquiry, but concludes Teiku, let it stand, meaning there's no resolution in that particular case. Okay, so just a bit more summary. This is the point that Arthur brought the day before. The Gemara turns to another issue pertaining of pits. Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Shmuel Bar Mata, if one digs a pit 8 tefachim deep, and 2 of the 8 tefachim are filled with water, so then how much dry earth, foul air do you have? If it's 8 and you minus 2, it's 6. So you've got 6 tefachim of foul air, dry foul air, call it, particles, etc. And then 2 of the tefachim are with water. But we found you liable if the animal falls in and dies from the foul air. What's the reason? Because we learned that a pit must be 10 tefachim deep in order for the digger to be liable for the animal's death. So how does this work if it was 8 and now it's 6? It's because for every tefach of water that's added, it's equal to 2 tefachim of dry land in the degree of foul air that it generates. So in other words, pit is 8, you minus 2 for the water, so now it's 6 tefachim of dry foul air, and 2 tefachim of water, which is double as lethal, is the dry air, which makes it 4 tefachim. So 2 times 2 is 4. So 4 and 6 is 10. You created a lethal pit, you're liable. Okay, so we understand that. So then the Gemara asks a question. It says, hang on, what if we tweak it a bit? They inquired, what if one digs a pit 9 tefachim, and one of the 9 tefachim is filled with water? What is the law? So then it becomes 8 tefachim of dry foul air, and the 1 tefach of water becomes 2 tefach of equivalent wet foulness. So do we say that since there's not so much water in the pit, it does not have the same degree of foul air as an 8 tefach pit containing 2 tefachim of water? Or perhaps do we say that since the pit is deeper than 8 tefach pit, it does have the same degree of foul even though it contains less water? Meaning, as long as it totals 10 tefachim with the equation of dry foul air, with the water adding to the balance, are you liable then, or does it have to be a minimum degree of water in order for that water to become extremely foul? That's the question. Then the Gemara says, okay, so maybe, so that's answering how much water or liquid do you need in order for it to become foul and toxic. Now the question is, how much earth do you need to be foul and toxic? Because it uses another example. If you dig a pit of 7 tefachim, and 3 of the 7 tefachim are filled with water, right? So that means you've only got 4 tefachim out of the 7 of dry earth. Do we say, so there's 4 tefachim of dry earth, and the 3 tefachim of water, you times it by 2 because of the toxicity, so it's 6 tefachim of foul water. In total, 10 tefachim. So do we say you're liable because the total equals 10 tefachim, or do we say there's not enough dry earth at 4 tefachim to be able to add to the lethal nature of the pit? So again, the first example we used, it was the right ratio of foul air and water to create a lethal pit. The second one, the right ratio, but it seemed to be that there was less water than the first. So is that enough for the water to be just as toxic? And the last example is the ratio was also right to equal 10, but there was far less dry foul air. So is 4 tefachim sufficient to be able to create liability? So what's the conclusion? The Gemara concludes, let it stand, meaning we don't know. Okay, so just another bit of review is after the last point of review, Rav Shizvi inquired of Rabba, if you widen the pit that's been dug by another person, but didn't deepen the pit, what's the law? Do you become liable for damages? So it depends if you hold by Rav or Shmuel, because if you hold purely by Rav, who says that it was foul air that makes a pit either lethal or liability for damage because it infects the person or the animal's physiology and the person gets injured as a result, either they breathe it in or their wounds are exposed to it. Does that make you more liable or less liable when you widen the pit? That's what Rav Shizvi says to Rabba. And
I know.
Tell me.
Can I answer?
Please.
Okay. If you widen the pit, the animal falls in.
Yes.
You're actually responsible for it. Okay.
Yeah.
But if it falls from the other side, you're actually not responsible because it's the other entrance makes it wider. So the one side makes it less safe, the other makes it more safe.
Okay, explain what you mean. You completely
Okay, so-
correct
okay,
the
so-
logic.
If you widen the pit and you make it more dangerous, the animal can fall in. So you're responsible for the death of the animal.
Yes.
Okay. But if he falls from the other side, you're not responsible for the death of the animal from foul air because the pit is wider. So I don't know how that works logically, but that's what I learned.
Excellent. So Arthur, you did your review well. Is that Rav Ashi? There's two retorts by Rav Ashi, because just to fill in the gap, is Rabba said to Rav Shizvi, listen, the second one did a favor because he reduced the foul air by creating it being wider. And Rav Shizvi says to Rabba, on the contrary, he made the damage closer by increasing the size of the hazard. So we don't know which way to go. So exactly as Arthur said, there was another Moira of Ashi who said, look, we can analyze this matter. If the animal that falls in dies from the foul air, then you know that the second one isn't liable because he reduced the degree of foul air that could be contained in the pit because you made it wider to escape. But if the animal died of impact, well, then we hold the second one liable because he made it more hazardous. That's to answer Gavin's question yesterday, because Gavin said, what if he didn't ask? Gavin asked a good question in response to your question, or your answer, is Gavin says, well, what happens if you're dealing with a case where you don't increase the one side of the pit, but you increase both sides of the pit? Because basically, Rav Ashi does say exactly like Arthur, but that's the second explanation. So Arthur, the second explanation is that say the pit is increased on the one side and the animal falls in that side. Obviously, the one that created that increase in hazard is liable. But if the animal falls in from the side that wasn't extended, then clearly the second digger isn't liable. So then Gavin asked a great question last night, and he said, well, what happens if this person like made it from a narrow thing to like swimming pool size all around? In other words, there wasn't an area that he didn't increase in terms of widening. Who's liable then? So then that's Rav Ashi's first answer, Gavin. So Rav Ashi said, well, clearly if he fell in and he died from the impact, then the second digger is liable. But if he died from the foul air, and it says, let's just say that underneath were branches and bushes or things that clearly that there was no impact for, then it was the foul air, then the second digger is not liable. So that's to answer your question. In fact, the term Rashi uses is padded it with cotton wool, so to speak, meaning that you could quite clearly see that it wasn't going to create any sort of hazard. So that answers both of your questions. Arthur, well done for the review. Really, really well done. So now we're on another section. Well, we're still finishing this in one respect. The Gemara discusses when a pit is deemed to have foul air. It's stated regarding a pit whose depth is equal to its width. Depth equal to width. Where are we talking about here, guys? That the vault or the square pit. But let's not talk about the vault because the vault's covered. The vault without a cover is a square pit. Okay. Rabba and Rav Yosef both reported opinions in the name of Rabba bar Bava Kamma, who said it in the name of Rav Mani. One of them, it was either Rabba or Rav Yosef, it says here in the Gemara. It seemed not to specify. There's always foul air in the pit unless its width is greater than its depth. In other words, when its width is greater than its depth, it can escape. And then the other one said there's never foul air in the pit unless its depth is greater than its width. So guys, they're saying the same thing in different ways. Does that make sense? So all opinions agree that when the pit's depth is greater than its width, it has toxic air. And when its width is greater than its depth, its air is not toxic enough to kill. But what they disagree with is when its width is precisely the same as its depth. According to Rav, who attributes, who said the attributes of the pit can only create liability for the foul air, the dispute pertains in all cases. According to Shmuel, for foul air or impact, The dispute pertains to a pit that is padded at the bottom. That's according to Rashba. Okay, very straightforward. Now we're going to do another section. The Mishnah stated, if there is a pit of two partners, and the first one passed by it and didn't cover it, and then the second one passed by it and did not cover it, the second one is liable to pay for damage that it does. So the Gemara inquires, from what point onward is the first one exempt? Okay. In other words, the Mishnah can't literally mean that the first one is exempt if he just passed by before the second one, because he's also negligent in leaving the pit uncovered. He's not absolved by his fellow subsequent negligence. Rather, here it's being specific. It means to exempt the first one in a case where he had justification to rely on his fellow covering it. Okay, when do you think that could be, guys?
When you passed in, when
you passed on the lid.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you passed by, the guy was.
And he said to him, "I'm giving you the lid."
Okay, so that's one of the opinions, but we're saying that before we even get there, you got to see that the other person is drawing water. Because if he's just sitting there and he's eating a sandwich, you can't just duck. He's got to take over the responsibility. So the argument is exactly as Arthur said. If you give somebody the covering of a manhole, that's the least subtle hint, and telling him you've got an obligation to cover it. The dispute comes, in fact, as Arthur was alluding to, is that when you just give the guy the pail of water to draw from the well, because that's not necessarily, or you see him take the pail of water. So that's the area of dispute. Some opinions say that that's enough to know that the other person is busy and will fix it. But the completely covered way is if you give him a cover, then you leave him covered, as Kevin would say.
I'm surprised, Damon, that they don't insist on any verbal instruction. Like when you go past handing the lid, obviously that's direct. But if the guy's busy, you say to him as you leave, listen, I'm done. You're going to take over. It's your responsibility now. Surely that plays, I never saw it there, but surely it plays a part somewhere along the line.
I would think it would play a big part amongst the along the line where he actually made a verbal declaration. And maybe that's the whole point of giving him the cover. I mean, you don't just hand somebody a cover. You hand somebody a cover with a verbal declaration saying, listen to me here. This pit is a hazard. I'm leaving now. Please take over and make sure that the pit is covered. I agree with you, Gavin. They probably make the guy an oath. They probably make the guy to an oath. In other words, it might be a case where he has to say in an oath, I told the guy to cover it, and the other guy has to swear that he didn't hear such a thing. Makes sense to me. You say,
James, it's just an idea I had. It's like if you give somebody, let's say you're the manager of a shop, and you give your keys to your employee, and you say, I'm going home now. Okay, it's implied that he has to lock up the shop to secure it, not to leave to go home with the keys.
Correct. So, Gavin, your declaration would be, how far would it go? Would it say, I'm leaving now? Or would it go to saying, I'm leaving now, cover the pit? How far do you think it should go?
I'm leaving now, cover the pit.
Yeah, I agree.
I think you need to be explicit. I really do. Because otherwise, it's a major problem. A guy falls down a pit, it's a human being, and obviously an animal as well. So if you were dealing with it, I think giving an explicit instruction and warning. I think, can one person give a warning though? Because you normally have to have two witnesses. That's the problem.
So one other thing, will they make the guy take a shavua, an oath, and say, did the guy not tell you he's leaving? So I think maybe Arthur's right. Is that a statement saying, I'm leaving now? Anybody knows that if you're leaving, you left there to close the pit. I don't know the degree of liability, but it does make sense.
No, listen, I think you're probably still accountable even if you leave out the words. I think you'll still be covered if you leave out the word, don't forget to close the pit after handing in the...
Kevin, you'll be covered if you give over the cover. Okay, so
But why would the first guy have uncovered it was it uncovered when he arrived on the scene, or did he uncover it to do things?
Okay, so that's exactly the point, is that it's saying that the minute you uncover a pit to draw water, whatever reason it is, you as the first person are liable. You can't just leave when you see a second person wandering towards the pit. You've got to see that they're taking the activity and before you leave. Otherwise, you're co-negligent, so to speak. So Rava and Rav Yosef both reported opinions in the name of Rabba Bava Kamma, who said in the name of Rav Mani. One of them, Rav or Rav Yosef, said the first one is exempt from the time when he leaves the second one using the pit. And what do we mean? He's not required to specifically convey responsibility to his fellow, but is exempt even if he walks off while his fellow is drawing water. So like Arthur said, the one opinion is saying that when he sees his fellow drawing water and he leaves, it can be assumed that whoever's drawing water is responsible by law. And the other one said he's exempt from the time when he hands over the pit's cover to the second one, like Gavin said, so that the first one presumably arrived at the pit by himself, right? He uncovered it to draw water, and then he was joined by his fellow. And in order to be absolved from liability, he must hand the cover that he removed to his fellow, thereby conveying responsibility to Hashem, to him. That's according to Rashi. Gavin, one thing though, Arthur seems to be right, that once he hands the cover to him, he doesn't have to make a declaration. Does that make sense?
No, and I agree with Arthur 100%. I'm just saying it's value add if you add that extra part.
It's covering you 100% in every way.
Covering you 100%. I said in all probability that Arthur would be covered, because it's right.
Gavin, in reality, because something doesn't happen, people aren't thinking something's going to happen when they pass something to the cover. Okay, let's say here's the cover. It doesn't happen often, so it's not a common thing to say, well, I'm giving you the cover, I'm covering myself. That's like extreme. We'd love to say that in fantasy, but in reality, it doesn't work.
So Rashi's agreeing with Arthur because he interprets the word cover as dalyo. In other words, he used the word instead of using the word a pail, because you could use a bucket pail. So some of the rabbis say, if you hand the person a bucket pail, it counts. And if you don't, in other words, it's a question of who has the pail. So if the person has their own bucket pail, you're not absolved from responsibility. If you hand in your bucket pail, the rabbis say you are exempt because you send me a clear message. Rashi said you've got to actually give over the cover. It's not good enough to give over the pail. That's why it translates it as cover. Okay?
See, that's making absolutely sure that the guy really understands. Maybe not verbal, but the bucket is. I would have thought the bucket would be enough as well, based on what Arthur was saying. But Rashi's also saying you've got to do both.
All right, and I would go one step further and say, here's the cover the manhole, exactly like Gavin said. All right, because people try and get out of things, and I'd find 2 witnesses. That's all I need in my life is some ox falling in. I'd be the ox to pay. I'd carry around, guys, if I was living in those times, I'd carry around a document, a shtar. Every conversation I had, it would be like a dictaphone. I would hire a little Arab scribe to come and write down everything and get the guy to sign. Everything. Ask Arthur. I wouldn't trust no one. All right, so listen, let's just quickly go through this. The Gemara finds a precedent for this disagreement. It's a matter of tonight dispute as taught in the following brisa. If one is drawing water from a pit, like a cistern, that he owns in a partnership with his fellow, meaning they're both entitled to use it, and his fellow comes and says to him, leave me here and I will draw water. Once the first one leaves, the second one using the cistern is exempt of liability for damages that it causes. Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov says he's exempt only when he hands over its cover. Okay. So So the first one is exempt when the second one says, leave me here, I'm drawing water. That's the cue for the first one that there's an acknowledgement, he's off the hook. Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov says no, he has to hand him the cover of the, what do you call it, the pit. So what's the underlying issue here? Basically, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov holds to the principle of Barera. Does everybody know what Barera is?
No.
Okay, so Kevin, basically it's a legal term and it refers to retroactive clarification. Okay, so what happens is I say to you, I think the best way to do this is when you're buying a house on spec. Now, at that time, the house isn't built yet. So when you buy a house on spec, you might have what you call a tennis court that's being built. And in that agreement, you say you paying part of the levies for the tennis court and everybody can use it. It's a retroactive agreement that once the tennis court is built, then you can all use it. But at that point, it doesn't exist yet. That's the concept of Barera. It's retroactive use or acknowledgement of what you can and can't use. But at that point, it hasn't been designated yet, or it hasn't been built. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So how does it relate in this case? Okay. Is that according, if we say that when the first partner draws water, he's filling the pail with water from his own portion of the cistern. Because technically, the partners built it together. They don't have separate bricks of what they own. They built it together. They paid for it together. So it's actually one, but they both got use out of it. So this concept of Barera is that the first partner, while he's busy, he owns the portion of the cistern. And when the second partner draws the water and filling the pail from his own portion of the cistern. So since the second one doesn't borrow the first one's portion when he draws water, he does not automatically assume responsibility for guarding it. And the first shares liability unless he hands over the cover to the second one. Now, the rabbis don't hold that.
Don't hold a second. Barera is there. When I listened to the words, I think it's right what you said. It was put in there so that if he puts 5,000 liters of water and another guy puts 5,000 liters, they put it together, it's actually considered separate. So separation of the water between the two. Otherwise they'll be both responsible for everything.
That's absolutely correct. Is that Arthur's got another term for it, which is valid. Meaning sometimes you can't distinguish. Water's a perfect example. If I join two different parts of water of 5 liters and 5 liters, you don't have a line drawn in the water, they merge. So then we say that each one has a portion when they're drawing it. Does that make sense? So that means that when the first one's drawing his, then the second one's drawing his, the first one is still liable because they're each drawing their own portion. They're not sharing it. It's seen as separate. But the rabbis don't hold like that. The rabbis hold that when the water's together, when you're drawing it, you're sharing it as partners. And therefore, the first one abdicates responsibility the minute the second one draws the water. Does that make sense? Okay, guys, we got a minute left. I think that's good.
I just want to send another link because I just, like 10 minutes or so.
No, we're good. Trust me, we're good.
I want to ask you, so Damon, so it's assumed so that one guy draws water, he leaves, and the other guy comes. It's assumed that he should be responsible. Does he have to be specifically told explicitly?
Yeah, so if you hold by the principle of Barera, you've got to make a declaration by giving over the cover. If you hold by the rabbis, where there's no validity to that principle, the minute the first one finishes drawing, he's finished of his responsibility and the second one draws. There's no sharing. There's no such concept of sharing. Does that make sense? And therefore, the second one takes responsibility. All right, guys, as just always cover yourself in legal matters.